to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itron, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Well, Tim, it looks like we got a budget deal. And, at first glance, I thought the legislature bested the governor this time. So Newsom didn't get his big wish list to streamline regulations to finally build this Delta tunnel that would transport water from Northern California to Southern California. He also didn't get the cuts to transportation that he wanted. So how about unpacking the deal for us and giving us the highlights?
Sure. So I think your analysis is spot on, that historically the governor wins in a fight with the legislature over the budget, and Newsom largely lost on this one. Ultimately, the budget that was passed, it has $1.8 billion in additional spending compared to what the governor proposed in the May revise. That's almost unthinkable. Jerry Brown certainly would not have signed a budget along those lines. What was weird is that there were even rumors that the governor was thinking about vetoing some of these bills, which would be a huge deal. But yet he basically kind of went along with everything that the legislative Democrats wanted in their wildly unsustainable spending plans. One of the main disagreements in the budget was on transit funding. If you watched our great video tour and listened to our podcast with Mark Jaffe talking about it, California's transit agencies are hurting. Ridership is way down. Most of them don't have efficient, streamlined operations. Transit agencies need to cut their budgets. And there really was no major ask for that in this budget. They said that there was some additional accountability measures included, but basically transit agencies across the state got the bailout. And so it kind of makes you wonder, what did Newsom really get, or what was the point of this multi-week holdout and signing at the last minute? What was also weird is, despite, the quibbles about transit funding, Newsom signed the budget actually sitting on a BART train with the chairman of the Assembly Budget Committee. Kind of defies logic. It makes you think, what was Newsom really pushing for this whole time if he was just going to essentially turn around and cave in? The last thing I would say on the point about the Delta tunnels, that's something we have literally been fighting about for over 40 years. Yes, passing CEQA reform and streamlining the rules for the Delta tunnels and other infrastructure projects would be very, very important. That should go forward. But to think that 40 years of debate would be essentially settled in a 2-week period in the state budget, I think that was pretty naive from the start.
Yeah, and that's pretty funny, Tim, because of the news reports that I read about the debates, that it was just too soon. It was rash. The governor hasn't really analyzed this and taken a good look and looked at all the other interests involved. So I just thought that was, just a bit much. But here we are.
Now, one of the things, though, since we went to a majority vote budget and changed the rules here, is that this is not the end of the story. Yes, the main budget bills have been enacted and signed into law, and several trailer bills have been enacted and signed into law. But we can continue the discussion into the summer, even into next year. So expect that any sort of loose ends, and maybe even including this Delta tunnels issue, they're going to continue negotiating and discussing things. So expect more budget trailer bills after the summer recess and until the end of session. So who knows, maybe they will strike a deal, but I'm very pessimistic that they are actually going to get this, because if they streamline the environmental rules, that's a huge step forward toward the Delta tunnels being built.
Tim, another issue that we've been following, actually, our Sally Pipes has been following, is Singlepayer. So what is happening there? Give us an update.
So last week, just before the 4th of July holiday, the Senate Bill 770, which is the kind of stepping stone approach to single payer by Senator Scott Wiener, had its hearing before the Assembly Health Committee. And it was, if you were a single payer opponent, it was a pop the popcorn moment. The California Nurses Association came out in force protesting the bill and arguing against it, as did the Black Lives Matter movement. And all of them said this is an insufficient bill and we need to have a real full single payer bill. Now, despite all of that, the committee still did move the bill forward, but it makes you wonder, what is its reception going to be as it moves forward to the Appropriations Committee and the Assembly floor? floor. Another interesting development is that Assemblyman Ash Kalra, who was the main proponent of last year's failed single-payer bill, and he has introduced a vehicle for another single-payer bill, AB 1690, he announced that he is going to go forward with a full single-payer bill and that he plans to introduce it next year. Definitely some interesting political theatrics on that bill. And of course, a new wrinkle in all of this is we've just inaugurated a new assembly speaker. We knew where Anthony Rendon stood on all of these things, but we don't know what the new speaker, Robert Rivas, is going to think about this. And by all accounts, he is much more moderate and more practical than Speaker Rendon. So that's a whole nother issue that we haven't explored, and we'll see what does he do when the Bills and Appropriations Committee are on the floor. Does he want to stick the Wiener bill in a drawer and not move the bill forward this year? We'll see.
Well, turning onto the national scene, we got a big victory in the Supreme Court. The court ruled that Harvard and North Carolina's admissions practices were unconstitutional. The suit was filed by a group of Asian Americans. This falls in the heels of California's Prop 16 in 2020, where California voters actually rejected proposition that would allow racial preferences in government policies, especially including admissions policies and hiring policies at state universities and working for the government. So everywhere we look, merit is under attack. And if listeners haven't already signed up, they ought to seriously consider signing up for a luncheon that we're having with Heather McDonald, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She writes about it in her next book, When Race Trumps Merit, and she'll be speaking at Newport Beach at the Pacific Club on July 20th. And we'll also have our senior fellow, Lance Azumi, moderate the discussion. And I'm sure he's going to have a lot to say about this new Harvard decision. So we think it's going to be a terrific luncheon, very informative. And if you haven't already signed up, we'd love to see you there.
And to give our listeners a preview, Lance already has a lot to say about this decision, as you might imagine. And he makes a very interesting point that we really haven't seen a lot in the coverage of this issue. He argues that, the systemic problem here is not, as many contend is the problem, which is systemic racism. He argues that it's the systemic failure of our public school system to prepare minority students and really all students, when you look at the poor and declining test scores, for higher education, not only to be admitted, but to succeed in higher education. And so that really is the takeaway of the ruling, is that the onus is now on the public school system to do the job that they haven't done up to this point.
So, Tim, how about introducing our next guest?
This week, we have a very interesting discussion with Ken Pope of the Victims of Communism Foundation. And so the Victims of Communism Foundation is a nonprofit that is dedicated to educating young people and promoting for K through 12 education, and promoting teachers have the right curriculum to teach about the horrors and brutality of communism throughout world history, which is certainly a subject matter that is really glossed over in our history classes today in most high schools and junior highs. And, it's important work that they do, and especially when we're seeing this kind of rise in democratic socialism, quote unquote, and, more and more young people thinking Che Guevara is cool to have on a t-shirt. They really do important work on educating both teachers and their students about the horrors of communism. So we have a discussion about their work, and also a new curriculum that they are rolling out for public schools across the country. So I think it's, as we this week are celebrating America and our freedom and all the sacrifices that people went into making our country the greatest, freest country on earth, I think this discussion of the horrors and brutality of communism reminds us really how grateful we all are to be Americans, and why it's so important to never give up the battle in the fight for liberty and freedom. That saying, freedom isn't free, that it's something we all must be prepared to fight for and sacrifice for and be eternally vigilant in fighting for. I think our conversation this week really reminds us all of that.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Happy 4th of July. And here's Ken Pope.
Ken, welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, gentlemen, today.
So Ken, for our listeners who may not be familiar with you, you've had a really interesting and diverse career ranging from the military to the private sector to now the nonprofit sector. Could you describe some of the highlights of your very interesting career? It sounds like you have some good, I don't know, maybe ideas for a book or maybe even a movie.
Well, thank you. That's quite the compliment. My kids have actually been after me to write a book for some time, and I've started that. So it'll take a while to get that done, unfortunately, because of my current job is pretty consuming, and rightfully so. It's a good position to be in now with Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and really gives me a great opportunity to tell some stories that need to be told, the history of this thing called communism. But my career was, as you look at it, was kind of bookended by 10 years in academia, first as a college student, where I was a young student during the Cold War studying, of all things, sociology of the Soviet Union. I had the class on that, and it's really sounded very interesting and became enamored with it. Just not so much, obviously, the communism aspect of it, but just, what that system is doing to its people. And even in college, I was hearing the same things that we all hear today, which is communism, it's actually working pretty well. It's just not done exactly correctly. They're still working on it, but overall, not a bad system, kind of maybe as fair as ours or maybe better. Some of my college professors said that even back during the Cold War, when you could see it a lot more. But I was also an Army officer, lieutenant in ROTC, getting ready to graduate. So my first assignment is on the East-West German border, doing patrols along that thing called the border itself, a fence. And I'm wondering to myself, my college professors are telling me this stuff, and I actually believe some of it probably. But you get over there and you're thinking, if this is such a great system, so equal, so fair, why are they keeping about 400 million people behind the fence? And that was kind of my first introduction to the brutality of that system. And then went on to, obviously, you've had the war on terror, the war in Iraq, perpetually for 30-some years, going back to the first war. So time in Iraq, when I became a Russian Foreign Area Officer, I actually had an opportunity to deploy, of all things, with a Russian Airborne Battalion to Kosovo and live with those guys for about 5 months. And then part of that period, too, was just traveling as I came back and started doing assignments in the FAO field. I worked in 2 stints in Ukraine, Estonia, Azerbaijan, but also traveled extensively across Russia and really got to see what that place looked like after going through this thing called communism for 70 years. Still a lot of problems that we can probably touch on a little bit later. And then when I retired from the military after 23 years, I worked in the consulting world. And then my final position before I came here to BoC was teaching at the university level. And I taught intelligence and national security studies for about 3 years and then ended up in BoC. And that's kind of the quick take on my military and professional career.
Well, Ken, that really is an amazing journey. But right now, you're the executive director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So could you give our listeners some background on the foundation and its mission?
Sure. So our foundation was started by, get this, of all things, a unanimous act of Congress, and then signed into law by William Jefferson Clinton. That created the foundation, which goal of the foundation at that point was to recognize the over 100 million people killed by communism since its inception back in 1917. So the goal was to build a monument located down in DC. It's close, about 2 blocks or so from the Capitol building. So that monument we created and put it in place in 2007 in a ceremony with George W. Bush. And then shortly after that, the founders of the foundation and also what we have now, a museum, thought, well, this is a good idea. Why don't we increase it from just this monument downtown that people see as they walk by? Let's have a museum to talk about, again, these 100 million people that have been killed by this system, and also the over 1.5 billion people who are still subjugated by it, in mainly China. So we have this mission for the foundation and the museum now, and we opened that museum last year in June. So the mission for BoC is to educate future generations about the ideology and the history and the true legacy of communism. Again, over 100 million people killed, and that's such a hard number for people to wrap their heads around. And we do that through a number of vehicles. First, 3 main cones here, if you will. So first is education. And under education, we have a national teacher seminar or educator seminar that we host every year in DC and in our museum now. And that's held this year, 10th through 14th July. So any teacher or anybody associated with education that would like to come to that event, please go to our website and you can register and take it. It's for teachers, you get 24 hours of professional development credit if you take the course. Also, we have a similar version of that online. So we recognize a lot of teachers can't come to DC for a week. So that we have the online version version they can take and get the same credit for it. We've created a new curriculum that talks about this thing called communism, and we are in the process of rolling that out on our website. It's going to be web-based, and it covers 33 chapters. It basically touches every country that's ever suffered under communism. We have a speakers bureau that we go out and we talk to either schools, universities, just civic groups, or anybody who would like for us to come and talk about what this thing called communism is all about. And we do that with other tools too. In my view, one of the best advocates for why the system is so bad are people who actually lived it. So we have this witness project where we film people who've actually experienced communism, lived it, and they can tell people what it's really like. Part of education too is our second cone, which is research. And mainly we have studies institutes within our foundation. We have one on China, one on Latin America. We do a Polish studies. We're looking at starting one on Vietnam and also one on the Baltic states. And we do a lot of, the last thing that we do is human rights. And again, mainly that is focused on China, Latin America, all those countries that are still suffering under communism today, and Venezuela as well, which is doing its best to become a communist nation, as you can see as you look at the news. So that's who we are, and that's what we do.
So during the Cold War, I think most Americans probably had a pretty decent knowledge about communism and its evil history. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall, much of that historical understanding, sadly, has been lost. So could you give, maybe your, it's a lot to ask for a 30-minute podcast, but give maybe your best arguments against communism, both in its theory and in its practice?
Sure. So let's start with a theory. So you hear this argument a lot. Well, it's just a theory that's been perverted over time. And I argue that's incorrect. I tell you that the theory fundamentally was flawed from the very, very beginning with its founder, Marx and Engels, as they put it together. They themselves fully acknowledge that the only way to bring this system called communism into effect was through two things: violence and revolution. And the loss of all rights that are taken over by the state. The state will now determine what is your basic human rights, if any. And typically it is that you don't have any, is how it eventually always falls out. If you look at their theory, and the Communist Manifesto is so frustrating. With you talk to people about it, they'll talk about it, but then if you ask them if they've ever read it, and they say no. It's a very short read. It's not a huge tome by any means, but it lays out 10 measures to achieve communism. And if you look at that and you compare it to our system of our form of government, we have our Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments. And those Bill of Rights tells people what the government cannot do to them. It tells them that their rights are inherent from their creator. That is not what those 10 measures talk about. They talk about this is what the state is going to do to you. And you talk to students, especially, the first one that everybody's really familiar with is the abolition of private property. And they are okay with that, usually because students don't have a lot of property, so they really don't care. There's nothing really tangible for them to lose. But as you start walking down the 10 with them, the next one of the ones that really starts to get their attention is abolition of all rights of inheritance. So they're not going to get the car, the house, and the money that their parents earned over their lifetime when they pass. It's going to go to the state. All the credit is going to be held by the state. We talked about means of production. It's means of production and also means of discussion. So everything is controlled by the state. So that's how they set it up from the get-go. So there was this thing was done incorrectly. It was designed to be a system that took everything from the people. Now, in practice, when it was put in place in its first instantiation was by Lenin back in 1917. By what has been known as the Bolshevik Revolution. But if you really look at that, it was mainly a coup. It was a top-down affair from Lenin and his guys. They were the most organized, the best armed, and the most willing to do violence. And they did. And that's how they took this thing over. Former Tsarist state of Russia had a weak interim government. Again, Lenin's group was far more willing to do violence, and they did, and they took over the system. So people look at Lenin in a lot of cases, you hear this quite often too, Lenin was, he was probably the good communist. And that also was incorrect. During his period of time, he was in power from 17 until 24 with his death, 7 million people dead in a civil war that really targeted people by their class and as political enemies. He also had a famine that was there, where 5 million of that 7 million died due to starvation. And he issues all these orders that just were so extreme. This famous hanging order that Lenin put into practice right away. It didn't matter what a person had done. They just picked people, 100 kulaks, basically property owners who had a little extra land, maybe they could afford a hired hand. They went after them, ordered to hang 100 of them, no matter what they did, just to make an example. And all because his government by the year 1918 was already failing economically. And he goes after the church very very brutally as well. Again, not because it was just a means to kill off religion, which is common to all these communist regimes, but also as a way to finance their government. So they went in and stole from the Orthodox Church 940 pounds of gold and over 550 tons of silver to fund their government at the cost of roughly 22,000 people murdered in the process. All that money did was fund their government for 1 month. So all that death and destruction for 1 month of government work. And then Stalin comes on board, continues that path of destroying religion. He kills roughly 20 million people. Then as it spreads to China, Mao, the butcher of all time, really, 65 million people dead across China's history with communism and still counting because it's still going on today. So that's what it really looks like. All you really get, as opposed to all the free stuff people think they get, is repression, loss of basic civil liberties, violence, and death throughout his history.
Yeah, it is a hugely dark history, Ken. And so, when the Soviet Union and its empire imploded, though, I think many Americans felt that communism was no longer a threat to our country. But, we are now facing the imminent threat of communist China. So could you give us your views on the dangers posed to America and to the West by Xi Jinping and his communist regime?
Yes, I think that's clearly our most serious national security threat, basically of our time, of my adult life. The Soviet Union was really a threat, but it was a waning power as I was coming up. But this the CCP has figured out a way to harness communism and basically the ability to trade and cover their crimes to where they get a lot of Western investment. But they are really the focus of all the basic fundamental problems that we're seeing really globally around the world. They have a formidable military that's growing, basically daily, and they have a pretty powerful economy. It's not great. It's not like ours, but it's growing. And they continue to get a lot of investment of the West, despite the knowledge of a lot of these Western companies and governments to what really is going on behind the scene there in that country. And they're willing really to do whatever it takes to win this competition with both the U.S. and the West. And it's really an all-encompassing threat across all domains, as you think about it: political, economic, diplomatic, military, information, cyber. They're everywhere, basically. And they're, again, just a huge, significant threat to this country that I think the West and the U.S. in particular is very slow to recognize and very slow to take action against.
So given your experience in the military, what's your judgment about how prepared we are militarily as Americans vis-a-vis communist China? And what, in your view, must we do to improve our defensive? And, I'm going to press you. How close are we to open conflict with Beijing over Taiwan, in your view?
Well, these are a lot of good questions. So I think I would start with the ones I feel the most confident about. So the military aspect, how prepared are we? So I think, over the course of the last, almost 20 plus years, we have been involved in low intensity conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we haven't been doing what would be needed for China, which is a peer-to-peer, significant superpower competition. So I think that, as a result, we are really just now starting to think about that and starting to take some action toward that. So I don't think we are as ready as we need to be. I'm very concerned about our war stocks, especially now due to the war in Ukraine. That conflict is definitely, we need to support them a lot better than we have. But modern warfare consumes material at such an incredible rate, and frankly, nothing like we have seen since World War II. That's the best analogy for it. And what you're seeing with Russia and Ukraine today, how much they go through on a daily basis. I think also the political will to do incredibly hard things in our country just isn't there. And I think that's really important, that we need to get the population, the government, and everybody else to recognize the same threat that we see in China. So you focus on the military, what was the military designed to do? Fight and win our nation's wars. And it's really should not be used as a test bed for a lot of societal trends or to as political favors in some cases, which I think is a problem. You're seeing that in the recruiting around the national security issue. You have kids who can't meet the basic physical standards that they used to be able to do. And they don't want to fight for a nation that they are taught, sadly, in a lot of our school systems around the country is inherently flawed, fundamentally racist, and it's really no wonder why, if you're telling kids that, why would you expect them to want to fight for that country? So I think there's a lot of things that we have to fix, both societal in order to make the military fixes as well. But fixing the military production and some of the acquisition pieces would be very important, especially on the military resupply stocks for this high intensity conflict that we would be looking at. But really, no one knows, what China's going to do. They know it's always going to be on their timeline. So it's just a matter of how they view the West, how they view the U.S., what do they think our reactions will be, and they'll do the calculus in their head to think that they can either they can win or they can't. And I think that's really what's going to determine their calculus about when they do that. And how would it turn out? I mean, again, nobody really knows how a war is going to end until the shooting starts. Look at Ukraine. Everybody thought the Russians were 10 foot tall and were unstoppable and would have, Kyiv and Ukraine locked up within 2 weeks. That didn't turn out that way. China really hasn't fought a war since its, last skirmish was Vietnam, and they really didn't do that well there either. So again, there's so many unknowns. I hate to say, how's it going to work or how would it go? Because so often when you do that, you look very, very silly at the end of that conversation when you actually see it unfold in the real world.
Well, thanks, Ken. At a more domestic level then, what's your judgment about the CCP opening police stations in the United States, the purchasing of land by Communist China, and the penetration of American educational institutions through the Confucius Institutes run by the Communist Party?
I think all of these are very serious. I think some of them are just serious infractions on our national sovereignty, obviously, but also all these are point to a very critical national security issues as well. So we need to ask ourselves, so why would the U.S. government actually permit those type of things to occur? And if you ask yourself in that same line of thinking, what would China allow the same thing to happen in their nation? I think we know the answer to the second part of the question. China would never allow something like that to happen. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? And is it really in our national interest? And I think we're just now starting to have those type of conversations that we've needed to have for the last 20 years, frankly. The CCP is really, the reason they want to put those stations around the world, I think, is strictly intimidation. The CCP and the society writ large in China, the government's only viewed strong if they can really crush all dissent and any unfavorable message, no matter where it pops up around the world. And that's why you have those things out there. They want to quash and intimidate anybody who stands against the CCP in any form. The farmland issue is really, that one I really struggle to understand why we allow that to happen in any case. A lot of these places are opened up or try to be purchased near sensitive military facilities out west. And the federal government, some cases our local and state governments allow this to happen. I think a lot of it's just for convenience and for profit in some cases too. Confucius Institutes, that gentleman is probably my pet peeve. I really, that one just completely befuddles me. Again, I taught intelligence and national security study where our students went into the intelligence community and we shared a building with, guess which organization? The English is a second language primarily for Chinese students. So almost every semester at the beginning, you would have these Chinese students sitting outside of our doors. And every time somebody walked in, one of our students or our faculty, they were taking pictures of them. So think about that. And we allow that to happen across the U.S. Colleges like it because they are paid up front. And they get a lot of money from the Chinese government. So think about it over time, probably billions of dollars into the U.S. educational system at the upper levels. A lot of them have closed. Very few of them exist under what was known as these Confucius Institutes, but they're coming back now under a new name. So these guys are never going to quit. They're going to continue to pick an avenue of attack or penetration into our country. And if they get called out on that one, they're going to change tactics a bit and come in a different way, trying to do the same thing.
So while communist China presents the most obvious communist threat internationally, and as we just discussed, to an extent domestically, what are some other non-Chinese communist movements around the world today that are, a potential threat to, U.S. interests and the cause of freedom?
Okay, well, I think if you look at I'll just start with the beginning, the remaining communist nations. So most of those really don't pose a serious existential national security threat to the U.S. like China does. So if you look at Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam, maybe the only other exception that's a threat would be a true threat would be North Korea, mainly due to their nukes and just a very unstable rule at the top of that. But you also have countries like we have China, obviously, that is spreading its tentacles, if you will, all around the world. So they're into Africa, they're into Latin America, and they're doing this brick and road initiative where they're creating a lot of economic and military and transportation ties to these countries all around the world and are being very successfully diplomatically. And the U.S. is really not doesn't seem to me, at least, to be pushing back as strongly as it could against China, and the rest of the Western world even less so. And also just internally on the U.S. perspective, I think part of the problem that we have with the threat of communism, if you will, is that people just know so very little about it, and they have a very favorable view of these things called communism or communism or socialism in many places. And a lot of that's just due to gross ignorance about what it really stands for. I mean, if you look at, thinking back the internal piece now, just recently came out just in the news recently was this Colorado Teachers Unit statement on capitalism. And they stated that capitalism inherently exploits children, public schools, land, labor, and resources. Kind of really a fundamentally warped concept of what our nation was founded upon and how we've actually worked and done business. I've had the fortune and in some case misfortune to both live and work or fought in about 65 different countries around the world. And I tell people everywhere I go, you will never find a country where you have as much wealth and as much opportunity as you do in this country here. And people just don't seem to want to be able to acknowledge that in some cases, sadly.
Well, and, digging deeper down domestically now, we remember the famous quote from Lenin, "Give me your children for 4 years and I will sow seeds that will never be uprooted." So American schools have been transformed in many cases into Marxist indoctrination camps. So can you give us your views on what's taking place in our schools?
Yes, I think in many schools, that's really a sad fact. And the other even sadder fact about it, and why I think we have this in so many cases, is that history simply isn't taught anymore, or it's not taught fully or really correctly. I've been, fortunate to be asked to review academic standards, across a number of different states. I'm not going to name the state, but I'll give you an example of one I recently did, probably about a few months ago. K through 12 academic standards for history and civics. 402 pages long, and Karl Marx mentioned only 3 times, and only then as an economist. Nothing about the Communist Manifesto. Lenin not mentioned at all. The Bolshevik Revolution not mentioned at all. The Gulags not mentioned at all. Stalin only mentioned 6 times, and 3 of those because his name was in Stalingrad. But what was inserted everywhere was race and oppressor and oppressed. I mean, you can understand that perhaps during the civil rights era or the Civil War, but in the Neo-Paleolithic era, they were talking about equity and inclusivity, back before guys had even really invented the wheel. And you got to wonder what's really going on in the system. And that, again, the oppressor, the oppressed, and dividing and cookie cutting people into their different groups is nothing new. This all started, we in America, we're kind of arrogant. We think we created cancel culture. We really didn't. That's been around since the very beginning of this thing called communism. It always starts the same way. It's the denunciation. Well, you're wrong. You do this wrong. Then it becomes more of taking things away from you. You lose your fundamental freedoms. You're now told what you have to say. And all this stuff is really is inserted itself within the school system as well. So we see it everywhere across our culture, but it's really, really sinking its tentacles deep into the education system. A lot of it's just, again, due to gross ignorance of history, but you also have people who actually, fundamentally believe that Marxism or socialism or communism even provides them a better system and provides them perhaps a path to the top. And what I always caution people is that people who think because they're part of the cancel culture or they're at the top, that they're safe when it really kicks off, they're wrong. Those people are usually one of the first ones who get whacked at the very beginning of it. If you look back at the Stalin period, 1934, of the 2,000 top communists in that system, 50% were executed that year because they ran afoul or viewed as a threat by Stalin. The very top, the roughly 139 Central Committee candidate members, 70% were executed. So my message is, if you think because you're advocating the system that you're going to be safe or you got in early on the ground floor, so did those guys. And they all ended up in the same place.
So in order to fight the Marxist indoctrination in American schools, your foundation has put together a curriculum on communism. So could you tell us about your curriculum, what it contains, and what you hope to accomplish with it?
Sure. So we still have a curriculum online in PDF form that covered, and it's roughly kind of geared toward the middle school level. What we recognized a need for was a new curriculum based on how students learn today. So we have this new system. The old version was 11 chapters. The new version that we're rolling out now, it's going to be all online. It's 10 sections, 33 chapters, and it covers roughly every country that's ever suffered under this thing called communism. And how we structure each one of the chapters is the following. We recognize that stories resonate best. So we start each chapter with a short story based on somebody's personal experience with communism. Then we have a peer-reviewed essay we write the essay about the topic, let's just say Marx, for example, and then we have it peer-reviewed by a scholar who did significant scholarship work on that topic. And then we create a number of exercises and activities that teachers can use in their classrooms. And we think a lot of how students learn today is both by watching videos and also podcasts. So we have what we call our watch, listen, and read section. So under watch, we have typically 3 to 5 minute videos, several of those, and then we have all the way up to feature-length movies and films. We have podcasts that are on there that are relevant to the topic, and then we have a selection of enhancement readings that the students can do, different books, biographies, or literature. At the end also, we have a chapter toward the very end is on literature and film. And we give recommendations across the globe where all this took place, from Europe to Asia to Latin America, stories, movies, and film from all those different people who've experienced it. Feature-length movies to just, a short, bio or a witness project video that we create ourselves. So it's all there, and it really lays out everything, again, designed for that high school student, targeting that 10th grader and those teachers who would use it.
Well, that sounds like a great curriculum, Ken, and I can't wait to see it. And it's so immensely needed in our schools to counteract the misinformation and propaganda that unfortunately too many kids are having to go through. So now, overall, what's your strategy to defeat communism in all its forms and wherever it appears?
I think that really the key is education. I think it's not just in the schools, but it's both the students and also society writ large. For those of us who grew up during the Cold War, we have a fundamental understanding of what that communism looked like and its results. I think today that's missing in a large segment of especially of our younger, population, those who didn't grow up in that period of time. So really we have to educate people with our curriculum, but also speaking engagements. I go and me and my team and our speakers bureau will go out across the country talking to any group, be it a school, a university, a civics group, educational groups, foundations. We go out and we talk to people. We're also working and partnering with groups such as yours to help spread the word about what we're seeing in the school system. But also one of the things that we get from parents and teachers is, well, you say this is bad, and we talk about it at these school board meetings and always get this pushback, well, what do you have to offer in return? And our job is to provide them something to put in place of some of the as you called it earlier, indoctrination that's taking place in some of our school systems. But really, it's got to be schools, and it's got to be society writ large is the only way we're really going to defeat this.
So, Ken, as we close, how can our listeners who are interested in learning more, find out more about your work and follow what you're doing?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, victimsofcommunism.org, and you have a lot of resources on there. You can go to our resources page, and you can see, we'll eventually have talks like this put on our website, as they come available to us. Anything that we do, like in a public forum, and we have a YouTube video or a podcast version of it, we place it on our website. So those things are there. Our curriculum will be there. The teacher seminar, our witness project that shows, or a person being videoed in a high quality, award-winning video format, telling their personal story that kind of resonates with people. So that's something that can be shared out there. And again, we just look for people to come and join us. So we are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We'll work with anybody who is willing to stand against communism in all its forms. But again, we're a nonprofit, so we're always looking for financial support for our education programs. So also on that website, you'll see a donate page. So please, if you like what we're doing and you feel the need to continue to contribute to this effort personally, then by all means, donate, support the cause, and help us to reach more people.
Ken, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and just look forward to working with you in the future.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.